"You're not management material. You're barely receptionist material," Richard Collins said, loud enough for the entire 32nd floor to hear. And just like that, the low hum of keyboards and muted phone calls faded into a silence so thin it felt like glass. Naomi Carter stood at the edge of the conference table, a slim folder resting calmly in her hands, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her and stretched across the polished marble floor. A few employees exchanged quick glances, then looked back down at their screens, careful not to be seen watching. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit, his movements precise, practiced, the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of believing he controlled everything inside those walls. The building itself seemed to echo his authority, 40 stories of steel and tinted glass rising above downtown Chicago, the skyline reflecting in the windows like a mirror of power. And to Richard, Naomi Carter was just another temporary employee passing through, another quiet name on a short-term badge. "I asked for the quarterly tenant summary," he continued, his voice measured but edged with impatience, not commentary. Naomi didn't move right away. She simply looked down at the folder, then back at him, her eyes steady, calm in a way that made a few people in the room shift slightly in their chairs. "I included the summary," she said softly, her tone even, professional, "but there's something in the maintenance contract that didn't look right." A faint smirk tugged at Richard's lips, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's not your responsibility," he replied, stepping closer, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the marble, each step deliberate, controlled. "Your responsibility is answering phones and scheduling meetings." A quiet murmur moved across the room, then faded quickly. Naomi held the folder gently, like it carried more weight than paper. "I understand," she said, still calm. "But the numbers increased nearly 20% compared to last quarter, and—" Richard raised a hand, cutting her off, the gesture smooth but final. "You know what the problem is?" he said, his voice lowering slightly, though still loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You're trying to act like you belong in conversations that are above your role." The words settled heavily in the air. Naomi didn't react. She didn't argue. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something deeper than the moment itself. Around them, the city stretched beyond the windows, taxis inching along Michigan Avenue, sunlight bouncing off neighboring towers, the world outside continuing without pause. Inside, however, the tension lingered. Richard took the folder from her hand, flipping it open quickly, barely scanning the first page before closing it again. "You're dismissed," he said flatly. Naomi blinked once, not in shock, but as if marking the moment quietly in her mind. "Effective immediately," he added, setting the folder down on the table with controlled finality. The room remained silent. Naomi reached slowly for her badge, unclipping it from her blazer with a small metallic click that seemed louder than it should have been. She placed it gently on the polished surface, her movements careful, deliberate, as sunlight reflected across the plastic card bearing her name. No one spoke. No one moved. Naomi Carter gave a slight nod, her expression calm, her dignity intact, then turned toward the glass hallway, her footsteps soft against the marble floor, leaving behind a silence that lingered long after she walked away. Naomi Carter walked down the glass hallway with quiet, measured steps, her reflection moving beside her in the polished panels that lined the corridor, each footstep soft against the marble floor as the morning light followed her like a silent spotlight. The office behind her slowly returned to its usual rhythm, keyboards clicking, muted conversations resuming, but something in the air had shifted, a subtle discomfort that lingered long after she disappeared past the reception desk. Naomi reached her small workstation near the corner window, a modest desk with a neatly stacked planner, a ceramic coffee mug, and a single leather folder resting perfectly aligned at the edge. She paused for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly across the smooth surface of the desk as if memorizing it. Then she opened the drawer and removed a slim notebook, placing it carefully into her bag. Her movements were calm, deliberate, unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. A few employees nearby glanced at her quietly, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether they should pretend nothing had happened. Daniel Whitaker from accounting adjusted his glasses and looked down quickly when Naomi met his eyes, offering only a small, polite nod. She returned the nod with a faint, warm smile, the kind that carried no resentment, only quiet grace. Naomi picked up her coat from the back of her chair, smoothing the sleeve gently before slipping it on, her posture composed, her shoulders relaxed. Outside the window behind her, the Chicago skyline stretched beneath a pale blue sky, sunlight glinting off the river as early traffic moved steadily across the bridges. Naomi glanced at the view for a brief second, her gaze thoughtful, almost reflective, as if the city itself held memories deeper than anyone in the office could see. A soft chime sounded from the elevator lobby nearby, and the metallic doors opened with a low, familiar hum. Naomi lifted her bag over her shoulder and turned toward the exit, her steps steady, her expression unchanged. As she walked past the reception desk, the security guard, Marcus Hill, looked up from his monitor and frowned slightly. He had seen employees leave before, some frustrated, some upset, some hurried, but Naomi looked different, calm in a way that made him instinctively straighten in his chair. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said quietly, unsure whether the greeting still applied. Naomi paused, her smile gentle. "Good morning, Marcus," she replied, her voice warm, the same as every other morning. She did not rush past him. She did not look back. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped inside, the polished stainless steel reflecting her calm posture as she pressed the lobby button. The doors closed slowly, sealing her in a quiet space filled with the soft mechanical hum of descent. On the 32nd floor, Richard Collins adjusted his tie and glanced around the conference room, satisfied that the interruption had passed, yet a faint unease lingered in his chest, subtle and unfamiliar. He brushed it away quickly, turning toward his tablet as sunlight shifted across the long conference table, leaving Naomi's empty space near the end of the room quietly untouched. The elevator descended quietly, each passing floor marked by a soft digital chime, while Naomi Carter stood still with her hands resting lightly on the strap of her bag, her reflection calm and composed in the brushed steel walls. Meanwhile, on the 32nd floor, Richard Collins stepped out of the conference room and moved toward his corner office, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, the sound echoing faintly through the open workspace. His office overlooked the river, a wide view framed by glass walls and dark wood accents, designed to reflect authority and precision. He placed his tablet on the desk, straightened a stack of reports, and adjusted the blinds slightly as sunlight filtered across the leather chair behind him. Richard had built his reputation on control, efficiency, and discipline, and every detail of the office reflected that mindset, from the perfectly aligned pens to the framed business awards hanging behind his desk. He believed hierarchy kept things orderly, and to him, Naomi Carter had crossed an invisible line, stepping beyond what he considered her place. Outside his office, employees resumed their routines, though a few still exchanged quiet looks, the earlier tension lingering beneath the surface. Melissa Grant from operations approached Daniel Whitaker and lowered her voice slightly. "She was just trying to help," she said, glancing toward Richard's office. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, tapping his keyboard without typing anything. "Richard does not like being questioned," he replied quietly, his eyes flicking toward the glass walls. The office lights hummed softly overhead, blending with the distant murmur of traffic from far below. Richard leaned back in his chair and opened the maintenance contract Naomi had mentioned, more out of habit than curiosity. He scanned the first page quickly, then paused for a brief moment, his brow tightening slightly as he noticed the revised pricing column. He flipped to the next page, his fingers slowing, though his expression remained controlled. After a second, he closed the document again, exhaling softly, convincing himself it was routine, nothing unusual, nothing worth reconsidering. He set the file aside and turned his attention to incoming emails, the glow of his monitor reflecting in the glass walls around him. Down in the lobby, the elevator doors opened smoothly, and Naomi stepped out into the wide marble atrium where morning sunlight poured through the towering windows, illuminating the polished floors and modern seating areas. The building felt quieter at ground level, the distant sound of revolving doors turning and soft footsteps crossing the lobby creating a calm rhythm. Naomi walked toward the reception desk near the private offices, her pace steady, her gaze relaxed, as if she belonged there in a way that went unnoticed by most people. The concierge nodded politely as she passed, recognizing her from earlier mornings, unaware of the change that had just occurred upstairs. Naomi paused briefly near the tall windows, looking out at the city streets where taxis lined the curb and pedestrians crossed under the bright Chicago sky. She adjusted her coat sleeve gently, her movements thoughtful, composed, then continued toward the private elevator at the far end of the lobby, her calm presence blending into the quiet elegance of the building itself. Naomi Carter approached the private elevator at the far end of the lobby, her footsteps soft against the polished marble floor as sunlight stretched across the atrium and reflected faintly on the brushed steel doors. A small security panel beside the elevator glowed quietly, reserved for executive access, a detail most employees rarely noticed. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a slim black key card, her movements unhurried, almost routine, as if this path was familiar. The security guard stationed near the desk, Marcus Hill, glanced up again, his curiosity growing as he watched her step toward the restricted area. Naomi lifted the card and gently tapped it against the reader, and a soft green light appeared instantly, followed by a quiet chime that echoed subtly through the lobby. The elevator doors opened without delay, revealing a spacious interior finished in dark wood and polished metal, noticeably different from the standard elevators used by staff and visitors. Marcus straightened slightly in his chair, his brow furrowing as he watched Naomi step inside, her posture calm, composed, as if nothing about the moment felt unusual to her. The doors closed smoothly, and the elevator began to rise, its movement silent, steady, controlled. Upstairs on the 32nd floor, Richard Collins leaned forward over his desk, scanning through emails while the maintenance contract remained set aside near his elbow. He paused briefly when his assistant, Melissa Grant, appeared at the doorway, her expression careful. "There is a call from building management on line 2, she said softly. Richard nodded without looking up. "Tell them I will return it later," he replied, his tone distracted, already shifting to another report. Melissa hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, closing the door quietly behind her. The office lights cast a muted glow across the workspace, and outside the windows, clouds drifted slowly across the skyline, softening the sunlight that had filled the room earlier. Meanwhile, the private elevator continued upward, bypassing several executive floors before slowing near the top of the building. Naomi stood still, her gaze relaxed, her hands resting lightly at her sides as the digital panel displayed the approaching floor. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with modern artwork and soft carpeting that muted every footstep. A woman in a tailored gray suit stood near the entrance, reviewing a tablet, and looked up immediately when Naomi stepped out. Her expression shifted into a respectful smile. "Good morning, Miss Carter," she said warmly. Naomi returned the smile with a gentle nod. "Good morning, Elaine," she replied, her voice calm, familiar. Elaine stepped aside, holding the glass door open as Naomi walked into the executive suite, where large windows framed the Chicago skyline from nearly 40 floors above the city. Inside, a conference table sat prepared with neatly arranged documents, and 2 men in business suits stood as Naomi entered, their posture attentive, respectful, as though they had been waiting for her arrival. Naomi Carter stepped toward the conference table as the 2 men straightened their posture, their attention focused entirely on her, while the morning light poured through the panoramic windows and cast long reflections across the polished surface. Elaine closed the glass door quietly behind her, sealing the room in a calm, insulated silence far removed from the tension downstairs. Naomi placed her bag gently beside the chair at the head of the table, her movements smooth and unhurried, then glanced at the neatly arranged documents in front of her. One of the men, Jonathan Reeves, senior legal counsel for the property group, adjusted his glasses and slid a folder slightly forward. "We reviewed the revised maintenance agreement you flagged," he said, his tone respectful, measured. Naomi nodded faintly, her eyes scanning the summary page as if confirming something she already knew. "The pricing escalation clause was hidden in the secondary vendor schedule," she said calmly, her voice soft but precise. If approved, it would have locked us into a long-term rate increase without review flexibility. The second man, Robert Ellison, Chief Financial Officer, leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Your observation was correct, he replied. It would have cost the building nearly $400,000 annually over the next 3 years. Naomi rested her fingertips lightly on the document, her gaze thoughtful as she looked toward the skyline beyond the glass. The city moved quietly below, traffic flowing steadily, sunlight reflecting off the river like shifting silver. That is why I wanted to review it before approval, she said softly. Elaine stepped forward and placed a tablet near Naomi, displaying a summary of the morning activity within the building. There was also a call from the 32nd floor earlier, Elaine added carefully. Naomi glanced at the screen briefly, her expression unchanged, though her eyes lingered on the note for a moment. Jonathan shifted slightly in his chair. Do you want us to schedule a follow-up with management? He asked. Naomi paused, her posture relaxed, her presence calm, yet quietly authoritative. Not yet, she replied gently. Let us finish reviewing the rest of the contracts first. Robert nodded immediately, sliding another document across the table. The room remained quiet except for the faint hum of the building systems and the distant murmur of the city far below. Naomi reviewed each page carefully, her attention focused, her calm demeanor filling the space with an unspoken sense of control. Down on the 32nd floor, Richard Collins leaned back in his chair as his phone buzzed softly again, the notification from building management still waiting unanswered. He glanced at it briefly, then dismissed it, turning instead to another report, unaware that the decisions being reviewed several floors above were directly tied to the very contract he had dismissed minutes earlier. Upstairs, Naomi signed a small notation on the margin of the document, her handwriting neat, deliberate, then looked up at the team with a gentle nod, her quiet authority settling into the room like a calm before something yet to unfold. The conference room remained quiet as Naomi Carter reviewed the final document, the soft glow of late morning sunlight stretching across the glass walls and reflecting gently on the polished table. Outside, the skyline shimmered under a clear Chicago sky, and far below, the movement of traffic looked distant and almost silent, like the city itself had paused. Naomi set her pen down carefully, her movements calm and deliberate, then leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window for a brief moment. The room felt still, grounded, as if her presence carried a quiet gravity that slowed everything around her. Elaine stood near the side console, watching Naomi with a respectful attentiveness, while Jonathan Reeves quietly gathered the reviewed folders into a neat stack. We will halt approval of the maintenance contract, Jonathan said softly, breaking the silence. Naomi nodded gently, her expression thoughtful but composed. Send a notice to building management, she replied, her tone calm, measured, and request a full audit of vendor agreements across all floors. Robert Ellison looked up from his tablet, clearly impressed by the quiet decisiveness in her voice. I will have the audit team begin immediately, he said. Naomi offered a small nod, her gaze steady, then rested her hands lightly on the table, her posture relaxed yet unmistakably authoritative. The air inside the room felt calm, but beneath the calm was a subtle shift, like something larger beginning to move quietly behind the scenes. Down on the 32nd floor, Richard Collins stood near the window of his office, reviewing another set of reports, the earlier unease still faintly lingering though he could not quite explain why. The sunlight had softened now, drifting across the floor in long, quiet beams, and the office had settled into a steady midday rhythm. Melissa Grant approached again, her expression careful, her voice low. Building management just requested a full vendor audit, she said. Richard turned slowly, his brow tightening slightly. An audit? He repeated, his tone controlled but edged with mild irritation. Melissa nodded. Yes, they said it was a directive from upstairs. Richard glanced toward the skyline, then back at his desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface. Fine, he said after a moment, though something about the request unsettled him. Melissa nodded and stepped away, leaving him alone in the quiet office. Upstairs, Naomi rose from her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her blazer gently, then walked toward the window, her reflection blending with the city beyond the glass. The sunlight caught softly against her profile, and for a brief moment, the room felt suspended in quiet anticipation. Naomi turned back toward the table, her expression calm, her voice steady. "Let us continue," she said gently, and the team nodded in unison, the quiet momentum building as decisions began to unfold beyond the awareness of those several floors below. Richard Collins stared at the email notification on his screen as the subject line updated again, this time marked with a priority flag, and for the first time that morning, the quiet confidence in his posture shifted slightly. The message came from executive administration, not building management, and the wording was brief but unmistakably formal. Requested presence of floor management representatives for immediate operational review. Richard leaned forward, his fingers resting on the desk as he reread the message, the faint hum of the office around him suddenly feeling louder than before. Outside his glass walls, employees continued typing and moving between desks, unaware of the subtle tension beginning to form inside the corner office. Melissa Grant appeared again, her expression cautious as she stepped into the doorway. "There is another update," she said softly. Richard glanced up. "What now?" he asked, his tone controlled, though less dismissive than earlier. Melissa held her tablet slightly closer. "Executive administration is requesting that you bring the vendor approval file and the tenant maintenance reports to the upper executive floor." Richard's brow tightened slightly. "Upper executive floor?" he repeated quietly. Melissa nodded. "Yes, they specified the executive suite." Richard leaned back slowly, processing the request, his gaze drifting toward the skyline beyond the window, where clouds now softened the sunlight across the city. The unease that had lingered earlier grew more noticeable, though he kept his expression composed. "All right," he said finally, standing and straightening his jacket. "I will bring the documents." Melissa nodded and stepped aside as Richard gathered the maintenance contract Naomi had mentioned earlier, along with the tenant reports stacked neatly beside it. The papers felt heavier in his hands than they should have, though he dismissed the thought quickly. He stepped out of his office and walked across the floor, his measured stride drawing a few quiet glances from nearby employees. Daniel Whitaker looked up briefly, then returned to his screen, sensing the shift without understanding it. The elevator chimed softly as Richard pressed the button, and the doors opened to reveal the quiet interior. He stepped inside, the polished steel reflecting his composed expression, though his eyes lingered on the documents in his hands. The elevator began its ascent, passing floors steadily, the digital numbers climbing one by one. Upstairs, Naomi Carter stood near the window of the executive suite, her gaze calm as she reviewed another report on the tablet Elaine had handed her. The room remained quiet, focused, the atmosphere steady and deliberate. Jonathan Reeves glanced toward the door as a soft chime sounded from the hallway, signaling the elevator arrival. Elaine looked toward Naomi, who gave a small, calm nod. Moments later, footsteps approached along the carpeted corridor, and the glass door opened gently as Richard Collins stepped into the executive suite, his posture professional, his expression controlled, though his eyes flickered briefly as he took in the room and the figures waiting inside. Richard Collins stepped fully into the executive suite, the quiet thickness of the room immediately different from the busy floor he had just left, and his eyes moved across the conference table, then toward the large windows, before finally settling on Naomi Carter, standing calmly near the far end of the room. For a brief moment, he did not speak, his posture stiffening slightly as recognition settled in, subtle but unmistakable. Naomi turned slowly from the window, her expression composed, her gaze steady and calm, the same quiet dignity she had carried earlier, though the setting now shifted everything around her. Jonathan Reeves gestured gently toward the table. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Collins," he said, his tone professional but measured. Richard nodded once, placing the documents carefully on the polished surface. "I was asked to bring the vendor approval file," he replied, his voice controlled, though the faint edge of uncertainty had begun to surface beneath it. Naomi stepped forward slightly, her movements smooth, unhurried, and took a seat at the head of the table, her presence naturally guiding the room without any need for announcement. Richard's gaze followed the motion, his expression tightening just slightly as he realized the subtle shift in authority. Elaine closed the glass door quietly behind him, sealing the space in calm silence. Robert Ellison leaned forward, opening the vendor file Richard had placed on the table, flipping to the maintenance agreement Naomi had flagged earlier. "We reviewed this contract," Robert said calmly, glancing briefly toward Naomi before continuing. "The escalation clause would have significantly increased operational costs." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, I reviewed it again," he said, though his voice sounded more cautious now. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the table, her gaze steady as she looked toward Richard, her tone calm and measured. "You dismissed the concern earlier," she said gently, not accusatory, simply factual. Richard felt the quiet weight of the room shift toward him, and he adjusted his stance slightly. "I believed it was within acceptable range," he replied carefully. Naomi nodded faintly, her expression thoughtful. "That is why we are conducting a full audit," she said softly. The word "we" hung quietly in the air. Richard's eyes flickered briefly, the realization growing clearer, though he remained silent. Jonathan Reeves closed the folder and looked toward Naomi. "We will implement the audit immediately," he said. Naomi gave a small nod, then glanced back toward Richard, her calm presence filling the room. The sunlight shifted across the table, catching softly against the documents between them. Richard stood still, the earlier confidence replaced by a quiet uncertainty as the moment settled, the authority in the room now unmistakably centered around Naomi Carter. The silence in the executive suite settled gently as Naomi Carter closed the folder in front of her, the soft sound echoing lightly across the polished table while the Chicago skyline shimmered behind her through the wide glass windows. Richard Collins remained standing, his posture composed but noticeably quieter now, his eyes briefly lowering to the documents before lifting again toward Naomi. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was clear, calm, and undeniable. Naomi rose slowly from her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her blazer with a small, deliberate motion, her presence steady and composed as she walked around the table. The sunlight followed her movement, casting soft reflections across the marble floor. "Mr. Collins," she said gently, her voice calm and even, the same warmth she had carried earlier that morning. Richard met her gaze, his expression careful, professional, though a faint tension lingered beneath it. "Yes," he replied quietly. Naomi paused for a brief moment, her eyes thoughtful, then continued. "Your attention to operational efficiency is valuable," she said, her tone measured, not critical, simply factual. "But sometimes the details that seem small protect the foundation of everything above them." The words hung quietly in the air, not accusatory, not harsh, just calm and steady. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning behind her statement. "I understand," he said, his voice softer than before. Naomi gave a slight nod, then turned toward the window once more, the city stretching beneath them in quiet motion. Elaine stepped forward and handed Naomi a small folder, and Naomi accepted it gently before turning back toward the group. "We will proceed with the audit," she said calmly, "and ensure transparency across all vendor agreements." Jonathan Reeves and Robert Ellison nodded in agreement, their posture respectful, attentive. Richard stood quietly, the earlier authority he carried replaced by a thoughtful stillness. The realization settling in fully as the moment unfolded. Naomi walked toward the door, her movements smooth and composed, and Elaine opened the glass panel for her. As Naomi stepped into the hallway, the soft carpeting muted her footsteps, the quiet elegance of the executive floor wrapping around her calm presence. Richard followed a moment later, stepping into the hallway just as Naomi moved toward the private elevator. The doors opened with a gentle chime, and Naomi stepped inside, turning briefly as the sunlight from the corridor reflected softly against her calm expression. Richard stood still, watching as the elevator doors closed slowly, sealing the quiet moment. The hallway remained silent, the city visible through distant windows, and Richard Collins stood alone in the soft afternoon light, the realization settling in as the building around him felt subtly different, steady and quiet, like something had shifted without a single raised voice, leaving only the calm weight of understanding behind.